To Whom the Wild Belongs, by Reno Hunt. Chapter 5. The birds chirped and chattered as the morning sunlight spread across the mountainside like warm butter over toast. Alan stepped out of the truck and stretched long and slow with a satisfied smile on his face that he simply could not remove. This was a complete contrast to yesterday morning when the sickness of his body matched the sickness of his soul, and every movement was a forced effort. Today, other than having a few sore muscles, he felt his heart fluttering with excitement and simply could not breathe in enough of the fresh mountain air. Alan was almost skipping up the road after eating some breakfast and packing a lunch. The 3 empty water bottles were filled and put in a much smaller backpack that a kid might carry his schoolbooks in. Several clicks up the road, his legs loosened up and felt like they could run to the summit. In what seemed like a walk to the mailbox, Alan was on top of the mountain, digging through his big pack for the camera. He pulled it out of the case, looking over its shiny black surface and rainbowed lens. This was a top-of-the-line professional self-stabilizing unit with a 50x zoom lens. Alan powered it up, realizing that this was by far the best camera he had ever used. Verifying that the power was good, he shut it down, recased it, and laid it on the ground. The camera would stay behind today. With no snow to capture tracks, he would need to cover some serious ground in order to identify the bear's range. The rocky terrain would not accept impressions, so he would have to find scat or signs of feeding. Light and fast would be the best way to travel today. He went through a mental inventory of his pack, pulling out all non-essential items. The pile of gear on the ground included the camera, the sleeping bag, and 6 of the 8 quarts of water. Remaining in the pack was 2 quarts of water, 1 pack of beef jerky, a first aid kit, a windbreaker, and a roll of bright red surveyor's tape. Now, where are you, you big, beautiful blonde bastard? It was right in this area that Alan had spotted the bear before, but he knew that its range was likely the whole mountain. It seemed logical to descend down the opposite side from which he had ascended to an elevation with a little more cover and some food sources for Mr. Spirit Bear. He made his tentative way across the questionable footing, often sending soccer ball-sized rocks tumbling down below him. This was not a place to be careless, because if a man started falling on these slopes, he might not stop for 500 feet. By that time, your head would have impacted enough jagged rocks that it really wouldn't matter whether you stopped or not. After 500 feet of methodical descent, the slope leveled out enough to support tree growth and allow one to walk without a hand on the ground. Very quickly, he found a thicket of mulberry bushes. They were green and sour right now, but once they turned red and began their impersonation of raspberries, they were delicious to people and bear alike. On his last visit, he nearly ate his weight in these tasty berries. This would be a good elevation to begin his search. Alan dropped the pack to the ground and unzipped it, pulling out the roll of bright red surveyor's tape. He tied a foot-long strip to the low-hanging tree branch so that it could be easily seen from all directions. The plan was to walk counterclockwise around the circumference of the mountain at this elevation until he hit the Forest Service road that he had come in on. From there, follow it to the truck for a good night's sleep, and do the same thing around the opposite direction tomorrow. This tape would just be precautionary in case he could not find the road and serve as the starting point for tomorrow's search. The walk was rocky and uneven at this altitude, but the sweet smell of the air and the lush green of the forest melted away the troubles of the world, and he almost glided through the bush. Several times he caught himself whistling as he walked. Since any bears would hear him well before he saw them, it was probably not smart to make a lot of noise when tracking. Alan felt a soft smush under his foot and knelt to sweep the ferny growth back. It was scat. Grabbing a stick, he broke it apart and dissected its contents. He was happy to find seeds and not fur or a local man's car keys. This was a black bear. Maybe the bear he was looking for, and maybe not. The important thing was that there were bears here, and this one wasn't a grizzly. Alan thought of the survivalists he had heard talking about a secondary harvest, which is basically eating the seeds out of the bear scat. He could not fathom how hungry a man would have to be for that little snack. More walking led to more scat, and after 4 hours, Alan found a fallen tree to sit on and have some water. One of his quarts was empty, and the other about half. I got to be coming up on that road soon. It wasn't altogether clear why he was speaking out loud, but it was clear that he suddenly felt very alone. Looking around, the vegetation seemed thicker and the air warmer, as if he had wandered down to a much lower elevation than intended. This would explain why it was taking so long to get to the road. The farther down the mountain you go, the bigger it is to walk around. The sun suggested early afternoon, so darkness was not about to fall on him. However, 4 hours one way means 4 hours back. It was time to pick it up and get to the road before he was out of time for the return trip. Alan jogged at a pace only marginally beyond a brisk walk to cover more ground while maintaining a solid footing, which could be the difference between life and death. The elevated physical activity took a toll on his dry throat, forcing him to stop several times for water. A half hour of the quickened pace generated no road and only served to deplete his water to a quarter of a bottle. This far from the point of his descent made returning via the same path problematic, as he could easily miss the red tape in this growth, especially with a darkening sky. The smart play would be hike straight up the mountain to get back to his summit base camp. Then he could hydrate and sack out in the sleeping bag or follow the road down to the truck, even if it was dark when he arrived. Alan turned up the slope and began gulping up terrain with attacking strides. The length of his descent was not clear after the initial 500 feet. It was entirely possible that he had wandered much lower during his walk. The important thing was to get to the top and emerge from this sick feeling of anxiety before it started to affect his decision-making. First, his legs warmed, then burned, then ached as he had to stop and gain his breath about every 50 feet. For an hour, he climbed and knelt and climbed some more. A searing burn dug at the back of his throat as the growing anxiety flowed through his veins, pushing him upward. Alas, the trees parted, and he scaled the final few rock slabs to reach the peak. Alan's heart sank as he turned in a slow circle, scanning the distant slopes and plateaus intently. Base camp was a bushy mountaintop with ferns and small trees dressing its scalp. Now he stood atop a mountain as bald as Gandhi. This could only mean one thing. Alan's worst fears had been realized. The mountain he had climbed was not the same one he had descended. Panicked eyes scanned the other summits, desperately trying to pick up a glimmer of color from the sleeping bag or a glint of chrome from the truck. It was no use. There was just too much vegetation. "Oh, Jesus, Alan. What have you done?" He dropped to his butt and pulled his acidic thighs against his chest, breathing deeply to clear his head. The decision made at this point in time would determine his life or death. The constant wind being forced up and over the peak was warm from the late afternoon sun, but once the sun went down, it would become frigid. The first thing to do was descend again on the leeward side of the mountain to get into some heavy vegetation where he could cut limbs with his knife enough to bury himself and preserve his body heat. Make it through the night and plan with a clear head tomorrow. Down was easier. At an elevation similar to where he started climbing, there was a heavy patch of conifers that would block any wind. Alan gathered any branches he could hack off and built a pile of limbs within a circle of the trees. When the thin night air came slithering through the scrub, he would crawl into the pile to hide, trying to keep as much vegetation between himself and the ground as he had between him and the cool night air. Heat may rise, but a cold ground can suck the warmth from your body like a sponge. Why do people die in the wilderness? The vocalization of inner thoughts was unexpected but soothing to his loneliness. They die of shame. It was a reference to one of his favorite movies. Alan was a huge fan of Bart the Bear. If you saw a movie in the 90s with an angry grizzly bear in it, you probably know Bart. One of Bart's movies had some city slickers that were in a plane crash in Alaska. They were armed with a few flares and an old man with a world of book knowledge in his brain. Two of the younger guys were, understandably, in a panic upon the realization that they were lost in the wilderness and that no one knew where they were. Charles told them that people who die in the wilderness die of shame. They wander around wondering, how did I get myself into this mess? instead of doing the one thing that could save their life: thinking. Alan crawled into the pile of branches and spent the next several hours fighting his mind to stave off the shame.